Tonight, we begin with a unanimous decision, that legal scholars had predicted, dismissed, and feared all at once. A ruling that unfolded not over months of deliberation, but in a single sweeping moment. A moment that changed the rights of millions of gun owners overnight. A moment that redefined what legal carry means the second you step into your vehicle. A moment that left attorneys, gun rights advocates, and law enforcement all scrambling to understand the new reality. What the Supreme Court decided today crossed a line that Second Amendment defenders had hoped would hold, and when that line moved, the legal landscape did not hesitate. It shifted with clarity, with unanimity, and with consequences that every responsible gun owner in America must understand right now. For years now, there had been signals, not from official press releases, not from formal legal briefs filed in public record, just signals, that the Supreme Court was preparing something that would reshape gun law in a way no one could fully predict. The court has been deliberate, yes, but they have been unusually strategic in their deliberateness. Their rulings have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a trajectory. But what set off alarm bells in Second Amendment legal circles? This term was that the pattern went silent. Legal analysts who monitor Supreme Court activity know the indicators: the absence of major gun cases on the docket, the quiet denials of certiorari on related appeals, the unexplained delays in lower court enforcement actions, and the sudden consolidation of conflicting circuit court opinions. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Supreme Court goes quiet on a hot-button issue, it means something is about to get very loud. That something arrived in the form of a 9-0 decision, unanimous, with implications that touch every single person in America who has ever placed a firearm in a glove compartment, a center console, or a locked case behind the seat of their car. Early this term, legal observers detected what they described as an alignment of judicial forces, including a consolidation of competing lower court standards that had not been reconciled in over a decade. These are the kinds of conditions that the Supreme Court only addresses when they are signaling something very specific: a desire to set a national standard, an intent to eliminate legal ambiguity, or a warning to lower courts that inconsistency will no longer be tolerated. Court watchers didn't know which category this ruling would fall into, or whether it would fall into all three at once. But what they did know was that the court was changing its posture on firearm transportation law. And when a court of this authority shifts its posture without warning, even by a single unanimous opinion, every legal practitioner in the country pays attention. The ruling addressed a deceptively simple question: when does a legally owned firearm become an illegally carried firearm, simply because it's inside your car? The answer, it turns out, is far more complicated than most gun owners ever imagined. The implications issued by this ruling tonight were not normal. They were not routine. They were not symbolic. They were urgent. Legal expert after constitutional scholar described the court's ruling as sweeping in its scope, precise in its language, and perhaps most importantly, immediately enforceable, meaning law enforcement agencies across the country can act on this interpretation today. But legal complexity only creates danger if the gun owner hesitates to learn. You cannot afford to hesitate on this. In fact, this ruling is among the most consequential Second Amendment decisions we have seen since District of Columbia versus Heller. Here's what we know. Within hours of the opinion's release, firearms attorneys across the country began issuing emergency advisories to their clients. These weren't routine newsletters. These were urgent legal bulletins, the kind that attorneys only send when they know their clients are operating in a legal gray zone that just became a legal red zone. Tonight, sources confirmed that the court's ruling turned on three critical distinctions that most gun owners have never been told about. First, the difference between transporting a firearm and carrying a firearm. Under this ruling, transportation, with specific conditions, may remain protected under the Second Amendment and relevant federal statutes. But carrying, even inside your own vehicle, may trigger state-level concealed carry laws, regardless of whether the firearm is holstered, cased, or locked. Second, the vehicle as public space doctrine. The court affirmed what several circuit courts had been inching toward, that a personal vehicle, when operated on a public road, is not a private space in the same legal sense as a home. This is the component that would have blindsided most gun owners if left unchallenged. Third, the loaded versus unloaded standard. The ruling drew a sharp line between a loaded firearm in a reachable location and an unloaded firearm in a secured case. The distinction matters in every state, but the court's interpretation may override how individual states have been applying their own standards. This is what made the legal community's reaction so urgent. The ruling wasn't just symbolic, it was immediately actionable. It represented the kind of decision that could result in criminal charges for otherwise law-abiding citizens if left misunderstood. And responsible gun owners, understanding that fully, must now respond with knowledge. Not panic, not confusion, but strategic, informed action. They must understand what changed. They must understand what didn't. And they must understand what they need to do before the next time they put a firearm in their car. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Legal analysts now believe that the court's unanimous ruling was designed to test the coherence of lower court interpretations after years of conflicting circuit opinions left the country in a patchwork of incompatible standards. The court wanted to see whether the legal system would self-correct. It did not. So instead, the opposite happened. The Supreme Court didn't issue a narrow opinion. They issued a sweeping standard that was so clearly worded, so carefully constructed, that even the most gun-restrictive jurisdictions took notice. You don't get a 9-0 ruling on a Second Amendment case easily, but today the court delivered one. Constitutional scholars speaking with legal media under background described the decision as a corrective reset, a way to bring uniformity to a system that had become dangerously inconsistent. But the ruling proved today that the court remains both protective of Second Amendment rights and clear-eyed about the limits of those rights. Their opinion was not only thorough, it was precisely worded so that lower courts cannot reasonably misinterpret it. That precision matters because it shows the court is not issuing ambiguous guidance. It shows that the justices are not passive observers. They are active architects of constitutional clarity. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scope of this ruling's impact. Concealed carry permit holders must now re-examine whether their permits cover in-vehicle carry in states that distinguish between transportation and concealed carry. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states have already begun reviewing their vehicle stop protocols in light of this new standard. Gun rights organizations operating at the state level have reportedly begun fast-tracking legislative responses to align state statutes with the court's new interpretation. This wasn't just a legal update. This wasn't just an academic clarification. This was a national reset of the rules governing how 80 million gun-owning Americans interact with their most common form of daily transport. This was a realignment of constitutional expectation, and that realignment is the one thing gun owners have struggled to keep pace with since Heller. For every protective ruling, there has been a wave of interpretive complexity that complicates what seemed simple. Remember, many gun owners thought their rights in their vehicles were as clear as their rights in their homes. They thought a locked glove compartment was legally equivalent to a secured gun safe. They thought state preemption laws had settled the question of how firearms interact with public roads. But tonight, the exact opposite is being clarified. Federal constitutional standards now have primacy over inconsistent state interpretations. The vehicle as castle doctrine does not extend as far as many believed, and the burden of legal compliance has shifted more clearly onto the individual gun owner. What makes this moment so significant and so urgent is that this ruling arrived at a time when gun law in America is already under enormous political and legal pressure. Gun rights advocates want maximum protection of Second Amendment freedoms. State legislators want flexibility to set their own standards. Law enforcement agencies want clarity and consistency in the field, and courts want a manageable, uniform framework to apply. The court is balancing these competing demands while navigating the most polarized political climate in modern American history. And when courts in that position issue a unanimous ruling, they're not doing it from timidity. They're doing it from institutional authority. They're doing it from a position of deliberate collective judgment. The court's opinion, now distributed to every federal circuit and state appellate court, was designed to signal that the judiciary is not willing to allow continued legal fragmentation on this issue. Justices made plain that existing conflicting standards were inconsistent with constitutional clarity. That is restrained judicial language for lower courts You've been getting this wrong, and it stops now. You don't usually hear that level of unanimity from the Supreme Court unless something fundamental is at stake. Meanwhile, legal experts are urging gun owners to take immediate, practical steps. They say, review your state's specific vehicle carry laws in light of this opinion. They say, consult with a licensed firearms attorney if you carry regularly. And they say, never assume that what was legal yesterday is legal today, especially when the Supreme Court speaks unanimously. These are not overreactions. These are statements from legal professionals who understand just how high the personal stakes have become. As the legal analysis deepens, we expect more clarity to emerge about exactly how this ruling applies in each of the 50 states. But what we do know is that the court's intervention was timely. It prevents years of additional conflicting rulings at the circuit level. It gives gun owners a foundation of constitutional clarity to build on. And it places the responsibility for compliance squarely where it belongs, on every individual who chooses to exercise their Second Amendment rights responsibly. What happens next will depend on how states respond in the coming months. If they align their statutes with this ruling, this moment will be remembered as the great clarification of firearm transportation law. If they resist, gun rights organizations and the courts have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in years, the legal ambiguity surrounding guns in cars appears to be receding. The courtroom is quiet, a different kind of quiet. And when the Supreme Court goes quiet after a 9-0 ruling, it means they are watching, waiting to see if their message was received. Because tonight, every gun owner in America learned something they should never forget. The Constitution protects your rights, but only if you understand them. The law is not on your side if you don't know what the law says, and ignorance, in a court of law, is never a defense. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The rules have changed. The standard has been set, and the only question that remains is whether you are ready to meet it. We will be here, watching every development, tracking every state response, and bringing you the information you need as the next phase of this legal battle unfolds.